Camp is awesome. So with that being said, we are going to dive in to our series again called Moods. And we have another fancy video. Check this out. All right, so the only reason we have fancy videos today is because Barrick sent them to me. I never would have on my own power came up with some nice videos like that. But all that to say, we're in Dean's the YouTube guy, but Barrick's pretty good. Barrick didn't make that. He just downloaded it from our curriculum. What?
Yeah, I was going to say.
What?
Almost full-time editor.
Almost full-time editor. Almost. Close. Wow. You guys should see this podium in this light. It is like nasty. There's like stains and ew, there's something wet. Oh, that was my coffee. That's actually me. I'm blaming you guys. There is some, I don't know what's going on over there. It's nasty. But anyway, we are in week 2 of this series called Moods. And actually, we're not technically in week 2 because, does anybody remember what we talked about last week?
I do.
That isn't a leader. Students that were here, do you remember what we talked about last week? What emotion, what mood we talked about?
I got pudding on me. Get a free point.
Anybody?
Anger.
Anger. Okay, Johnny. One person remembered what we talked about. And actually, if you remember, I literally sat up here for about 2 minutes and talked. It was a super quick talk, and we went right into small groups. And as I was preparing for this week, I was planning to move on to the next mood, move on to the next emotion that we're going to talk about. I actually stopped and thought, I'm like, hey, we should really talk about anger some more, because I think we kind of glossed over it last week, and we're going to have some new discussion questions. They are not the same small group questions as last week. I promise you they're completely different. And we're going to have some more discussion about anger. But I want to spend the next few moments talking about this because I think this emotion, this mood of anger is something that is very relevant to a lot of us. I think in one way or another, we all deal with anger at some point in our lives. And in this series, we're talking about these different moods, these different emotions, and we're looking at how we can get control over our emotions instead of letting our emotions control us. Because I think a lot of times, as humans, we let our emotions, we let our moods control us instead of getting control over them for ourselves. And I showed this picture last week, and I'm going to show it again to kind of set the tone for today. We have anger from Inside Out. Anybody fans of Inside Out? Raise your hand. Yeah, you don't have to be ashamed. Like, Inside Out is a good movie. It is a really good movie, very well done. But anyway, this guy, Anger, I think sometimes we can relate to him a little bit. This little guy, he rises up in us every once in a while. I talked about this in high school last week. For me personally, and hopefully none of you can relate to this because you're in middle school, but for me personally, my anger rises up when I am driving. All right, I will admit that I deal with a little bit of road rage. I'm thinking maybe Tyler has experienced that once or twice. I just yesterday, actually, I drove a lot. I drove from Westminster up to Hanover, then I drove up to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and then I drove up to Lancaster. And I was kind of driving all over. It was like 4 hours of driving by the end of the day. And I could probably tell you 4 or 5 separate times where I had just a moment of road rage. Poor Allie in the car with me had to deal with that. But my philosophy is that I'm always the best driver on the road, right? Some of you high schoolers who are just starting to drive, you may think that every once in a while, that you are the best driver on the road. For those of you who are in middle school and you can't relate, and Mackenzie's shaking her head, she's like, I am not the best driver. Everybody has road rage because of me, because of Mackenzie. But no, those of you who are in middle school, maybe you haven't experienced road rage. Maybe you've experienced your parents' road raging or one of your siblings. I don't know what it is. You're shaking your head like you've seen that before. You've seen this guy come out of like the worst timing in the world. You're fired. You've seen this guy come out of your mom or your dad every once in a while when they are driving. What does that say? you almost ran over that old... When?
We were pulling into the parking lot at my house.
Oh, yeah. She took so long. I'm sorry. I think she saw me pulling in and was like, I'm just going to put the walker out here. And she just took her good old time. Sorry, that's mean. We're going to have to edit that out. Little fun fact, Dean puts little messages on the back of the screen there while I'm talking. And sometimes I really have to squint to see them. So you all got to enjoy the fun of that one. But anyway, like I said, whether you have experienced anger yourself or whether you've been around somebody who has anger problems and gets angry very easily, the truth is anger affects all of us. And listen, get this. This is important. If we're not careful, it is very easy to let that emotion, that powerful emotion of anger, control us instead of us getting control over our anger. And like I said at the beginning, that's what we're talking about in this series. We're talking about these different moods, these different emotions, and we're looking at how we can get control over them. So the kind of tricky part, though, about anger is that not all anger is bad, believe it or not. Not all anger is bad. When we see things that are displeasing to God, or maybe we see things that somebody's doing that is hurting them, or maybe even hurting other people, it is a good thing sometimes to get angry. There is such thing as a righteous anger. If you remember Thomas's favorite Bible story, we talked about it last week in C4, or maybe we did briefly in C3. Even Jesus himself was angry. In Matthew chapter 21, if you want to go read a crazy story about Jesus in the Gospels, you can check out Matthew 21. Jesus, he went into the temple, which is basically the church. It was their church back in Bible times where the people worshiped God. Jesus went into the temple and he saw a bunch of people doing things that they should not have been doing in church. They were disobeying God. They were dishonoring God and the temple. And what did Jesus do? He got angry. Yeah, Landon, he flipped over tables. This little dude, even though he didn't exist then because Inside Out wasn't a thing, the emotion of anger that this guy represents came out in Jesus. And it was for a good reason, because people were doing things that were dishonoring and displeasing to God. So the truth is, not all anger is bad. And that can kind of make this whole conversation a little more complicated. Anger can move people in a positive direction. Anger can move toward positive change. So either way, whether it's good, righteous anger, or whether it's bad anger, which I think is what most of us resonate with a little bit more, the negative side of anger. No matter which side of the spectrum it is, the truth is, anger is a powerful emotion, and it can do a lot of damage. So, the question is this: what do we do with anger, and how do we keep destructive anger from causing harm? That's the question we're going to answer today. We're actually going to look at a passage in James. The scripture will be on the screen, or there's actually Bibles under your chairs. If you want to open a hard copy of the Bible, it's totally up to you. We're going to be in James chapter 3. And a little bit of context, a little bit of background on this dude, James. Fun kind of fact about him: James was not a believer in Jesus when Jesus was on earth. Also, another fun fact, James was actually the brother of Jesus. So get this. Jesus, his own brother, was not a believer in him while he was on earth. The whole time that Jesus was ministering here on earth, and all the miracles he performed, and all the people he healed, and all the crazy things he did, James, his own blood-related brother, did not believe in him. It's crazy. It wasn't until after Jesus died, was buried, rose again, and literally floated up to heaven that James started believing in Jesus. Now, I think at that point anybody would start believing in Jesus. Like if a dude gets killed, comes back to life, then just like floats up into the clouds. Like I'm going to believe whatever he says about himself. And that is when James started believing in Jesus, after he ascended to heaven. And then James actually went on to become one of the most influential people in the church. He became one of the greatest causes for Christ in the early church. And he actually ended up writing the letter of... Anybody? What letter did he write? What was his name? James. And that's what we're looking at today. The letter of James. And in the letter of James, the book of James in the Bible, James talks about a lot of different moods and emotions that we deal with. And the chapter that we're looking at specifically today is chapter 3. And chapter 3, does any high schoolers remember last week what I said chapter 3 is all about? Like, what's the theme of James 3? Anybody? Anybody? The tongue, all right? The theme of James 3 is all about the tongue. It's all about our words, the things that we say. And I think it's very fitting because I think a lot of times when we feel anger or when we experience anger, it often comes out in our words. It comes out in the things that we say to other people, or maybe it comes out in the things that other people say to us, and that's what causes anger. So this is really important, and James talks a lot about our different moods and emotions, and we're going to look at James 3 starting in verse 13. James says this, he says, "Who among you is wise and understanding? By his good conduct, he should show that his works are done in gentleness that comes from wisdom." So you see, in this first verse, you can leave that up, Dean. James, he makes a connection here. He's saying that gentleness comes from wisdom. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think of the word gentleness here, I think of the polar opposite of anger, right? If anger's like over here on this side, gentleness is way, way over here. Like it's a completely different thing. So James, what he's saying here is that we gain gentleness when we gain wisdom. So how do we get this gentleness? Check out the next verse here, James 3:14. He says, "But if you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your heart, don't boast and deny the truth." This verse right here, I can decipher it and put in a little more common terms. James is saying here, if you're feeling this bitter envy and selfish ambition, these emotions, these feelings of anger, don't hide it. He's saying call it out. We said this last week. The first step in fixing a problem is addressing and recognizing that you have a problem. So what James is saying here is he says, if you feel these emotions, if you have these feelings kind of lodged up inside of you, call it out. Let the truth be known. Do not deny the truth that you are feeling these things. And then he goes on to say this in verse 15, and these two verses pack a punch here, 15 and 16. He says, such wisdom, this emotion of anger, this thing that we're dealing with here inside of all of our hearts does not come down from above. He's saying it doesn't come from God, but is earthly, unspiritual, and he even says demonic. For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there is disorder and every evil practice. You can leave 16 up there. I want to talk about this for a second. What James is saying here is he says, when these feelings, when these emotions of bitter envy and selfish ambition and anger and all these things, when these feelings get lodged up inside of our hearts, they eventually come out in our actions. What's going on inside of us will eventually come out and be shown. And that right there, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of James 3. It's like, oh, gee, thanks, James. Like, you're just telling us, like, all right, there's unspiritual and demonic practices in us, and all these things, there's just disorder in every evil practice. Then he kind of just leaves us at that. It's a little depressing, right? But then if you look in verse 1 of the very next chapter in James, in verse 1, James asks this very powerful question. He says this, what is the source of wars and fights among you? Now, I could stop right there. And you all could probably give me a dozen or 2 dozen or 3 dozen answers to that question. What is the source of wars and fights among me? Mom, dad, siblings, teachers, school, online school. And you could probably go on and on and on and give me a whole list. You might be able to point to some people in the room. I don't know. And you could say, yeah, I was waiting for that. Maddie's like, Tyler, what is the source of wars and fights among you? A lot of us can often point to the things that are outside of us. It's her fault. It's his fault. It's that teacher's fault. It's their fault why there's fights and wars in my life. But here's the funny thing. James, in this scripture, he's not buying it. He goes on in the very next part of verse 1 and he says this, don't they come from your passions that wage war within you? So James is saying, yeah, your mom might annoy you. Your siblings may bug you to death. Online school might be driving you crazy to the point that you're deciding just to drop out of school altogether. We get that. But that's not the problem. The problem isn't them, him, her. It's not whoever you're pointing that finger at. The problem is within you. It's within me. The problem is us. And here's kind of the bottom line I want to leave you with here in my next slide. As long as we think that the problem is outside of us, we'll never take care of what's going on inside of us. As long as we point the finger at other people and say, they're the reason I'm angry, they're the reason I'm frustrated, it's that driver's fault why I just honked at him and cut him off. As long as we're doing that, and as long as we're pointing the finger at other people, you know what happens? They have control over our anger. They have control over our emotion. And listen, when somebody else has control over your anger or your emotions, that means that you don't. And that's the whole goal of this series, is to gain control over our moods, to gain control over our emotions, to get that self-control back. And listen, guys, I wish I learned this much earlier in life. And I'm not that much older than you, so that's why I am constantly working on this. As I was preparing this talk the other week, it was preaching to me. I was completely hearing everything that I was writing. And it's important for you guys at a younger age, even than me, even than some of your leaders in the back, to get this truth. That it's not their fault. It's not his fault. It's not her fault. It's not mom and dad's fault. It's not the teacher's fault. It's not the school system's fault. It's not whoever it is on social media's fault. You are responsible for your own actions. You're responsible for your own emotions and moods. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to be done. They are taking communion in there and singing another song, so we have time to do some groups. I love you, God. Thank you for this time. Thank you for every single person here in this room. God, thank you that we have the option, we have the ability to gain control over our emotions. God, you give us the ability, you give us the power and the strength to work on these things, to not point the finger at other people, to not pass blame, but to take responsibility for our own actions. Pray that we'll all do that this morning. God, I pray that we will all realize that the problem starts with us, not with other people. We love you, God. Help us to work on this. It's in your name we pray. Amen.